Hey guys, welcome to Hope It Helps. And my guest on the show today is Miss Mimi Nicklin. Mimi, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. So, for the people who don't know, me and you connected through LinkedIn. Actually, I heard about you through Sania, who I had on the pod, who's the host of the Coffee Banter podcast, and I heard your episode on that, and I thought it was really, really interesting. So, and I love the work you do surrounding empathy and so on. 'Cause that's an area that I'm quite passionate about as well. So, I thought it'd be amazing to have you on the show. But for the people who don't know Mimi, just give us a little bit of background about yourself, and we'll take it from there.
Sure. So my name is Mimi Nicklin. I'm an author of a book called Softening the Edge, which is a recent international bestseller all about the empathy deficit. What is empathy? Why we need empathy in our businesses and our world, and how we can take that forward, how we can perhaps change things a little bit with more empathy. So I've written that book. I have a podcast and a breakfast show. And now I spend my life full time as an empathy advocate, working mainly in culture and creativity and how empathy sort of can impact organizational change and people in organizations, but also communities. So, that could be a sports team or any other form of organization, and really talking about how that can change our world.
Yeah, no, that sounds really interesting. And I think a lot of people nowadays, empathy has become quite a hot topic, especially and especially in recent times. And probably, if anything, you made a good point on Sania's podcast that last year it was probably around, but it wasn't at the forefront. But now, given COVID and this year, it really has come to the forefront and everything. So I think being an empathy advocate, you couldn't be a better time to be doing that. But I'm curious, when was empathy always something you were passionate about, or like when did you become so interested in it, so passionate about it? How did that start?
Yeah, for sure. It was and it wasn't. For most of my career, I have talked about intuition, and I always knew I was a very intuitive leader. I couldn't name it, but I knew that I was good with people and that people enjoyed my leadership style. And I would always put that down to intuition. And that wasn't very helpful, right? When young people say, can you help me understand how do you do that? Or what are some of your learnings? I was never very good at verbalizing it because I was always like, well, I just sort of know how to be with people. And then in 2018, I had moved to Dubai and I was with a business coach over lunch, again, talking about intuition. And she said, Mimi, can I stop you there? Is it intuition or is it empathy? And I was like, no, it's not empathy. I'd never thought about empathy in the business world. It wasn't a term that I had spent much time with. So when I left that lunch, I did what all good millennials do and Googled it and started to read about it. And, very quickly, I was into years of research and studying the neuroscience of empathy and understanding the empathy deficit and what that is. And before I knew it, it became my life. And now, as I said, this is what I do every day. I'm creating content around empathy with the vision to inspire change in a low empathy world through content, conversation, and discussion.
Yeah, and something you said that was interesting, that there's a difference between empathy and intuition. So, assuming so, how would you describe the differences between the two?
So intuition is do you know what, no one's ever asked me that, actually. Funny, that's a good question. But intuition is a feeling, right? It's an inexplicable, non-scientific, almost like a sixth sense, right? It's something that we can feel as human beings. It's something that for sure we've evolved to use it. There's some kind of, like a sixth sense that we know if there's danger pending. Mums have it with their children, all those types of things. But it's a feeling. Whereas empathy is a skill set. Empathy is something that is built into our prefrontal cortex. We're born with it. Again, it has developed throughout evolution as something that's within our prefrontal cortex. It is there with a very specific reason to help human beings thrive, to help us work together. Because what we know from an evolutionary point of view is we are better together. As humans, we are stronger when we work together. And that is what that empathy ability is there for. So it's a skill set. And the great news is it's a skill set we can nurture, we can practice, we can get better at. Whereas I said, intuition is far more of a feeling that some people have more or less of.
Yeah, actually, I think that's a very good way to distinguish between the two. Would you say that if you have a strong intuition, naturally, like someone like yourself, that you always had that feeling and that's why you were good with people, does that kind of play into how quickly you could start being good at delivering empathy. If you're very in tune with yourself, I think you'd be able to be quite in tune with how other people would be feeling as well.
I would make that assumption, yes. I mean, the data would show that, as I said, all of us have equal levels of empathy. And I often talk about using empathy as a choice, because you choose to do it. You know, you choose to activate that skill set. So from a data point of view, we all have exactly the same ability to empathize. But I think, you know, intuitively, I would agree with your assumption, which is that people that are just naturally more in tune with themselves and their environment, and just kind of tuned into energy and what's going on and who's feeling happy, sad, and otherwise today. Yes, I think that's a really fair assumption, that those people probably are also more able to make that choice to empathize, to use that skill set more readily.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. And it would be, yeah, like that'd be a fair assumption to make. And I know that, so during your career, you've traveled all over the world, you know, to different places and so on with your advertising career. And I was starting to think, because I think culture also let's say, like you said, empathy is a skill set and a choice, but
Yeah.
and everyone can learn it. But I think in different cultures, that let's say the empathetic baseline can be different because of the culture and because of how how, you know, how people express themselves in that culture. So what, in your experience, what have you found that is it in, for example, in the West, is it more, what's the word, more welcoming, or was it more, are people more aware of that topic, or is it very, very dependent?
I think it's such a great question, and I would love next year or the year after to do the world's first sort of empathy indexing geographically, because it is a question I get asked quite a lot, and I think it would be fascinating to actually measure that, and it's never been done, you know, on a geographical basis. What I can tell you from my own experience is that the difference between collectivist versus more individualistic societies, you certainly experience more empathy more naturally in those collectivist societies. So Asia and Africa, predominantly the Middle East as well, there's also scores quite high on collectivism. Those environments where people are more used to living in groups, living in close proximity. Many of them have come from a tribal background of some sort, and they're still living in many of those societies in large parts of many of those countries and areas. In those collectivist societies, empathy, understanding others, being connected to what other people want, more cohesion in neighborhoods, with societies, those things definitely, in my experience, come more naturally. When you look at the Western markets, which do tend to score more high on individualism, you know, cities like New York and London and Tokyo, for sure we see lower levels of empathy, because we also see higher levels of people living alone. So in some of those big cities, you're looking at 38 to 40+% of the city with individual dwellers, so people living on their own all the time.
Yeah.
So for sure, in those more individualistic societies, I think it's, again, a really good assumption, but it would be my experience as well, that empathy is lower in those environments.
Yeah. No, and I think I think the point you mentioned about collectivism versus individualism makes a lot of sense when you're talking about empathy. And I think that's a really interesting idea to do the index. I'm so curious to see what
Right?
what would come out of that, because like you said, I don't think you've probably done much more research into this than I have, but I don't think there is anything like that at the moment.
No, certainly not on a geographical level. And I think beyond that, there are two great enemies to empathy. I always say one is time and the other is stress. So when you have low time and high stress, you see low empathy. Because when we're stressed, physiologically, the way the hormones in the body work, you cannot empathize. The body, it's the fight and flight response. The body will push blood out of those parts of the brain. You actually cannot empathize when you're in a state of stress. So when time is short and stress is high, we see low empathy. And of course, that also correlates to city life. In those cities where you've got this always on, overnight, on a train, off a train, obviously outside of COVID, but that real sort of rat race life, those suppress empathy. So it would be geographical, but also, you know, societal, and how different parts of the world live and how that impacts their empathy level. So I'm with you. Let's do it.
Let's
Let's
do it.
finish the call and work it out.
Yeah, I'd love to. I'd love to be a part of that. That sounds really interesting. And I've never heard anyone speak about the two enemies of empathy. I didn't even know there were that. But I think the way you described it is perfect about time and stress, because when I'm really stressed out, like you said, you're not physically able, like biologically or chemically able to have that extra step of compassion, have that extra second to listen to someone. It's just, I'm too involved in my own world and I can't, you know, deal with whatever you're going through at the moment. So I've never heard of that before. But something you also said in Sania's podcast, which I thought was interesting, is we were never taught empathy. Empathy, like growing up, it should, and the way I was thinking about it, if it's a skill set and it's a choice and you can take like it could be a curriculum, for example, why do you think that was never taught, even in the societies like the collective societies that we've been talking about? It probably wasn't even taught there. Why do you think there's been a disconnect between that being a crucial like part of life and a skill set that we need to learn?
I think that probably we didn't realize what was happening, right? So we have 3 decades of declining empathy. We've got data that shows that empathy's been on the decline for 30 years. And so much of that will be wrapped up with, you know, the sort of second or third industrial revolution, the speed of life, the obsession with money, the crash of 2008, the geographical spread of people, urbanization, the role of technology. We've been really busy, right, the human race, evolving and running all the time. And I think we didn't notice. You know, I think we, for a very long time, and I think 2020 has proven this, we were seeing the symptoms, right, of this detached and disconnected society, and the things going on around the world from a health point of view, an emotional wellness point of view, a disconnectivity point of view, cyberbullying, anxiety, you know, all of these things, they're kind of bubbling, but only now are people starting to say, oh, hang on, there's probably a bigger picture here. You know, we probably shouldn't just all take antidepressants and carry on as we were, which is one of my big sort of pain points that I'm really passionate about. Is why is it, Khaled, that it's okay for, you know, my friend, my sister, my cousin, whatever, to be taking antidepressants in order to go to work? Like, when did it become normal to medicate ourselves in order to spend 5/7 of our life, which is what we spend in the office or in a role? You know, those things, I think they just crept up on us. So it's silly, actually, that we should have to teach it, because evolution gave it to us. It was a gift. It's in our brains. We should be able to use it. But again, back to those enemies of empathy and the speed of change. And as I said, we've been very busy, the human race. I think it crept up on us. And I think now we're realizing that there is a bigger picture and that we need to recalibrate. And of all the negative things that COVID has created, I think one of the positives is this conversation has a renewed sense of energy, and people are really interested in this conversation.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you said, because I wasn't aware that for the last 30 years, empathy's actually been declining, because I would say in the last few years, because I'm trying to relate it to like the mental health and meditation and well-being space. So 10 years ago, let's say, no one in the world probably was talking about meditation, about wellness, both in their personal lives and in corporate. Now, there's a huge push for that, for mental health and well-being and so on. So do you think empathy is now coming in, and that's going to be the next, I guess, the big push for the next few years, or like for the future?
I think so. You know, I keep talking in sort of my keynotes and stuff recently about, you know, is empathy the word of 2021? And I think possibly it is. Now it's easy because I spend my life in empathy, so my vision is quite tunnel vision. But yes, I mean, there is now Google. I saw great data this week. I shared it on my Instagram. Great data from Google search analytics that shows that the search for empathy and empathy related content has gone up 6-fold since 2010. I think it was 2008, 2010. So, you know, the behavior online is changing. People are looking for empathy. They're searching for empathy content. The media has changed for sure. As you said, I mentioned it on Sania's podcast. This time last year, you would be hard pushed to find the word empathy in any magazine or podcast or whatever. And now probably you'll find my name with it if you find it, because I've been busy, but it is out there. You know, I get media requests. I've been on, you know, NBC and HBR and, you know, really Entrepreneur and Vogue and all these crazy publications that I could never have imagined were going to ask me to write for them, because there is a change. So is it going to be the word for 2021? I think for sure it's going to be up there in the top few.
Yeah, no, I think I would agree with you. I actually recently had someone on the podcast. His name is Ali Salama, and he's a mental health, you know, advocate. And he has he has a podcast called Empathy Wins. So I was like, okay. I asked him on the podcast, and I'm curious to hear what you would say. Is there a limit to empathy? Do you understand what I mean? Is there a limit to how much compassion and understanding can I give you before I have to make a certain decision and so on? Do you know, what do you think?
Mm-hmm. I know the question. I think, firstly, empathy and compassion are different things. So I think
Okay.
there is definitely a limit to compassion, right? Compassion is sympathy, basically, slightly different, but more or less, compassion, sympathy, pity, that's one sort of set of emotions. And there is a limit to that. You cannot sympathize, because let's be honest, normally when you're feeling compassion, sympathy, or pity, you're sad, or some level of sad. That is a sad emotion. And there is definitely a limit to that. You cannot feel pity forever, for them or for you.
Yeah.
That's sustainable. Empathy, no, I don't think there is a limit. I think we have to have boundaries, right? You can't go around and empathize. I try, by the way, but you can't go around and empathize with every single person all day, every day. You have to have some levels of boundaries, and of course do your own things in the world, right? You have to make your own momentum and progress. And I think people often ask me about, and I think this is sort of linked to your question, is empathy related to burnout? If I empathize too much, will I burn out? Well, again, lots of data going on to sort of work out the answer to that. But the data I enjoy most is from the healthcare sector. And it shows that actually when burnout goes up, empathy goes down, not the other way around. So empathizing more, understanding human beings, doesn't make us burn out. But when we are burnt out, we find it harder to understand others. So no, I don't think there's a limit to empathy. Fundamentally, empathy is about understanding, right? It's about taking perspectives.
Sure.
We can't have a limit in how many perspectives we can take. That's just about being human.
Yeah. And actually, I think you mentioned a very good point that I guess in my perception of it was wrong, that I associated empathy with compassion. I thought the ability to be empathetic is also the ability to be compassionate. But you made a good point that is not a negative emotion, but it's a sad emotion. And empathy is a completely, it sounds similar, but it's not. Yeah, exactly. It's mutual. And one thing you said that was really interesting is the concept of we have to have boundaries, right? So let's say I'm a person, I want to be empathetic. How do I start setting those boundaries? Because I think that's something that's a lot of people might struggle with.
Look, I think that the key thing to know is that because empathy is about understanding, there's two things that's really important about empathy. Number one, you don't have to agree. Okay. To empathize is not to agree. I can understand somebody and relate to them and understand their context and perspective, stand in their shoes without agreeing with what they stand for or what they're saying. Number two, empathy is judgmentless. There's no judgment in empathy. We are seeking to understand, not to judge or agree. So I think when you're creating your boundaries, knowing those two things is really helpful, because it allows you to create your box. I want to understand this person. I want to lean in. Maybe it's your boss. Why is my boss behaving like that? Why are they so X today? Why are they responding to me like that? Why are they emailing me like this? Really seeking to understand. And actually, if you read any of Steve Covey's work and The 7 Skills of Highly Effective People, 20 years old, but still utterly excellent book. And he talks about it first. I think it's number 5, seek first to understand. You don't really need any boundaries beyond that, other than to know my job in this scenario is to lean into them, is to understand their context. Once you've got that straight in your head, I think you're okay. The other thing, as I said, is to understand the difference between empathy and sympathy. And one of the things that might help the listeners as well, and I love this example, is, so people ask me all the time, but empathy brings you closer to people, right? Empathy is about me understanding you, why you're doing this podcast, what your relevance is. Sympathy is, as I said, it's feeling pity. Now, in the great picture of that, what that means is that empathy pulls you together because you're understanding, you're becoming more unified. Sympathy creates distance. And Brené Brown, who, if your listeners know, go listen to her. If you don't, look her up. She's brilliant. But she has this little skit, it's like a cartoon on YouTube, and about empathy and sympathy. And she says, it's quite funny, she says, if you're walking along a road and there's a big hole in the road and there's someone at the bottom and they're shouting for help, empathy is jumping into the hole with them and helping them get out. Sympathy is standing at the top and saying, oh, I'm really sorry you fell in the hole. You're keeping your distance, right? So I think that kind of links back to how you have boundaries. Just understand what empathy is. And then you're able to lean into it, to raise your awareness and work out how you can do that best in the scenario that you're in.
Yeah, I think, first of all, I love that example. That example, even for me personally, now I understand. Now it's really clear and I get the difference between the two. And what you said about that empathy brings you closer together, and sympathy not doesn't take you apart, but keeps you at a safe distance. And that's,
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I was thinking, so everyone speaks about empathy a lot nowadays, and you've done the research and so on. I was thinking, okay, let's say, because you said empathy is a skill set and it's a choice. So
Mm.
the way I looked at it, I'm like, okay, if it's a skill, then I should be able to apply the same rules as any other skills. So with, let's say if I'm learning the piano, first I need to understand the keys and so on or whatever. But I don't think anyone's talked about what would like an empathy, if I could do a course and get an empathy certificate at the end, what would that look like? What are the factors that would need to be in there to map out like a course for empathy?
Yeah, absolutely. It's something I love to talk about. I think most of them, so that we can talk about some of the skills, but most of them come back to listening in some form. Listening is probably the backbone of empathy. And ironically, similar to empathy as a concept, we don't teach people to listen. We don't teach our children to listen. It's not in schools, and it's certainly not in the workplace. And yet we're supposed to do it all the time, because in order to thrive, we need to understand each other, right? So the first skill set that you would have to hone and perfect is the art of listening, not hearing, but listening. And I think you'll be able to relate to this, because we all can. How often you sat in a meeting or, around a dinner table, someone's talking to you and telling you a whole story, but actually in your head, you're wondering, like, do you need to take the dog out? Where are you going to go shopping next? Did you buy your mum a birthday card? So you're not actually listening. You can hear them and you can probably follow, but you're not really listening. Now, the reality is subconsciously that person knows, because us humans, we're very in tune. So even when our conscious separates us out, our subconscious is working. We know we're not really being heard. And that changes the behavior all the time. Now, I can promise you, because I test it over and over again, when you apply all the sort of skills of empathy, so you listen with your whole body, right? So your body language is facing in. You'll see a lot now on this video, I'm leaning into you all the time, even though we're on a Zoom screen, right? There's a lot of eye contact. I smile a lot. I nod when you're talking. My shoulders are facing you. All of these things are subconscious markers in your brain. Your brain is recognizing them. We are tuned to recognize those things. And you cannot underestimate them. And yet we forget all the time. We constantly on our phones, multitasking, saying, yeah, I'm hearing you. Yeah, I know you are, but that's not the point. So, technology, which can also enable empathy, by the way, but technology, distractions, again, this busy life takes us away from these skills that are actually very natural to us. So those are some of the, if you did a course, as you said, to get a certificate in empathy, those would be some of the things that you really practice. There's another thing which is really fantastic and just really fun to talk about, which is mirroring, which is built from our mirror neurons in our brains. And the most basic example is yawning. I talk about it in my book. But when you yawn, someone else's yawns, and in fact, actually, just by hearing the word yawn, you often yawn. You may yawn in a minute, but someone listening for sure is already yawning. Okay, so it's the mirror neurons that do that. It's a survival mechanic. So the other thing that would be in your empathy course, if you did it, would be around how to mirror behavior. Now, that doesn't mean explicitly copy people, because that would be a bit awkward, right? But responding to how other people are. So if their tone is very fast and they're talking very fast and they're obviously really busy and you talk really slowly, and it won't work. They'll be irritated with you, okay? Because they feel you don't understand me. I'm in a rush. You need to reflect my energy. So, mirroring tone, mirroring body language, mirroring energy in that way. Again, lots of it's subconscious, but it has an amazing impact on how people feel seen and heard, which is a fundamental human need. So those would be some of the things in your empathy course. Maybe we should do it.
Yeah, we should. And I love I'm very familiar with mirroring, because I took a course all about negotiation. And that was one of the key things that they said to use. He's like, when you go into negotiation and you use it in everyday life, and at the beginning it can feel uncomfortable, because you're like, oh, do they know I'm mirroring them? But after a while, I think you get used to it, and it really helps you build a good rapport and connection with the person. But I think the bedrock of any empathy course, like you said, is the listening. And the example you use, that we are very in tune. Like, I know if I'm speaking to you and you're not actually listening to me, or like you're just hearing me, like you said. And one thing I read about that is this is how you know if you're listening or hearing. If someone's speaking to you and you're just thinking about the next thing to say, you're not listening to them. You're just
Mm.
hearing them. And
Yeah.
that was a really big like wake up call for me personally, because I always thought, oh yeah, I am listening, but it's when you start paying attention to it, your brain's like, oh no, what should we say next? What should we say next? You're not really like focused on what the person's saying. And one thing you talked about in the podcast, which was really interesting, is we never looked at empathy from a gender perspective, but when going back in history, culturally and naturally, women tend to be, if we're going to generalize, women tend to be more empathetic. It's not that men can't be, it's just that given culture and given the world and how everything's developed, women had to, they're the ones that were talking. They're the ones that didn't go off to war. They're the ones that, had to keep the family together. So I was trying to think, if that's the case, let's assume there is some type of imbalance. How do we start to level that out? Because, and again, as from a men's perspective, especially in certain cultures, it's not right to, I guess, show emotion. It's not right to, be empathetic. It's very individualistic almost in a way. What would you say?
Look, I think particularly from a cultural point of view, so in cultures where there is still a very sort of traditional patriarchal male role in society, the way to fix that is by focusing on the data. And probably my favorite slide or sentence is that empathy is a data set. And a lot of what I'm doing, and I talk to lots of men, lots of senior men and lots of men in the Arab world and places where some of those patriarchal societies are in place. This is what I talk to them about. This is, and you just mentioned it, negotiation skills, right? These are skills that help you sell more. They're skills that help you work with your clients better, that convert customers. They drive loyalty. They win you business. They make you money. Empathy is not about being emotional, okay? Yes, it is an emotional intelligence skill, right? It's coming from that part of your brain, the cortex there. But it's not about being emotional in that sort of stereotypical, I don't know, crying, emotional, sad way. Like, it's nothing to do with that. It's not even in the same world, right? This is your data set. This is your ability to understand people. And again, back to Steve Covey, when you can understand, you can build a relationship. And when you can build a relationship, everybody knows, right? The Arab world is built on relationships. When you have good relationships, you sell, you grow, you do better business. So I think really, if we're going to talk about, gender parity, gender balance from a empathetic point of view, that's the discussion we need to be having, that this is a skill that can turn your business around, but it's also a skill that's going to create strong, loyal, cohesive teams, which again is what you need, whether that's your business, your religious institution, your sports institution, your community center, your society, wherever you work and live, your family, in the home, you need strong, cohesive teams.
Yeah. No, and I think that's a very good point. You do need strong cohesive, and empathy is, I guess, the right way or the best way to start building those out. But also, when I was thinking about it from an organizational perspective, I think one of the issues that us as human beings, we have two things. One, we don't like change, and if we do change, we want to see the result instantly. And I think especially in a work environment with an organization, I think empathy, first of all, has to start from the top, come down, because the person at the top is the one that sets the culture for the rest. And maybe some of the hesitation or some of the drawback could be like, I can imagine a manager be like, oh, I tried empathy yesterday, I didn't get the instant result I wanted, so no, this doesn't work. Do you understand what I mean? So how do we shift that perspective to understand that it's not just an action, it's about a whole cultural shift, and it's going to take some time to get to the place that we're trying to get to?
Yeah, and that's it. That is the conversation. It is going to take some time. Again, I think it's about, what I'm doing, having more of that in the world. So more awareness and more data around it, more of the evidence, more explanation of the benefits, because as we've discovered, it's something we're all built with. So it's a choice to use it or not. And creating more habit around it. Now, we are going to see slower uptake from people that have had longer careers behind them when they haven't really been doing this. So if you've already got 35 years behind you and you've never cared for this type of engagement, it's been an autocracy and what you say goes, and you sit in your office on the 27th floor and get on with it, unlikely, right? Unlikely that those people are going to change. And you're right, culture does start at the top. However, there is change we can make within our organizations if we're not at the top, whilst that change is perhaps happening in the C-suite or from a larger sort of wider set. And empathy is contagious. So even if someone's listening today and they're in a team of, whether it's 5 people or 15 or 50, you can create empathy in your own teams. You know, if you're within an organization that isn't imbuing that, that doesn't mean you can't do anything. You know, there are changes to your own team culture, your own team meetings, your processes, the way you structure your status meetings or your weekly meetings, to imbue this and to spread it a little bit. So yeah, I always say to people, I'm not going to try and convince those that don't want to be convinced. Do you know what I mean? That there's, as far as I'm concerned, there's no reason not to try to understand each other better. There's only upside. But if you're not interested, then you're not interested.
Yeah, no, and that is a sentiment that I totally resonate with. Is, you know, I think you can't convince someone who doesn't want to be convinced, and I'm not going to spend my time, you know, trying to do that. And also think that you can't help someone that doesn't want to be helped. Like, you can do the best you can, but if that person or that is not convinced, or they don't want to receive what you're trying to say, nothing's going to happen. So
Yep.
it's better for both of you to just go, I guess, go your separate ways in that case.
Yeah.
And one thing you said, though, and I think this is a misconception that a lot of people have, because at least in my perception, empathy it's a very positive thing. It sounds like it's easy, but you said that being an empathetic leader is not. And I know, given my own experience, and to actually be an empathetic person, it takes a lot of work, and you have to really, like, I don't know what the word is, like, really try to be curious and to understand where that person is coming from. So, but I think a lot of people have a misconception that, oh yeah, empathy is something easy to do, which is not.
Look, I think it's quite a multifaceted answer. I think it's quite easy. It is quite easy to understand people if you take the time and effort. Do you know what I mean? Even if you try it tonight with your family member, to try and really understand what they're saying when they're talking about their day, you'll find that on a one-off occasion, it's quite an easy thing to do. But I think you're absolutely right that to sustain that takes practice. But more importantly, I think what's really difficult and what makes empathetic leadership harder, and what I often talk about regenerative leadership, is to be able to respond to the data and the decision making that comes off the back of being an empathetic leader. So, you know, I talk in my book a little bit about when I was turning around the business and I had to make redundancies. I had to change staff for the good of the business. We needed to. I had global requirements, local requirements, skill sets that we didn't have. But I had a team of amazing human beings, you know, lovely, wonderful people. Nobody wants, and you know, nobody who's ever been made redundant or has had to make people redundant knows there is no good way of doing that, right? It just sucks. Okay. But you can do that with empathy. And, you know, I always commit to trying to make sure I do. But it is a little bit harder, right? Of course, I mean, I can't consider life any other way, but I do understand, I do empathize with some leaders that they might just want to bring people into a room and say, hi, Mimi, I'm really sorry, your role's no more redundant. Please speak to HR and I'll see you next week. I understand that some people want to do that. So, you know, making that change to spending more time, to understanding people's realities. As we said before, it takes time, it takes energy, but the benefits in every single way make that effort worthwhile, to the individual, to how the individual talks about your organization, to what they say to the team that hasn't been made redundant, that's waiting outside the door, to how you rebuild, to how the value they give you back in the interim and post, all kinds of benefits. So, you know, you're right, it can be, it can take more time and more effort, but then in life, I think most things that are worthwhile probably take time and effort.
I totally agree with that last part especially. And like you said, it is difficult to sustain. And this year in particular, because I had someone recently on the podcast and I was like, this year was probably the best. Like you said, it's not no one, because we're talking about how in COVID, lots of companies had to let people go. So, and like you said, there's nothing nice about that, and it does suck. But like you correctly said, and I think that this is a crucial step, is how did you carry out that process? Did you, like, she gave me an example of Airbnb, who, even though they had to let people go, they either like give them counseling, or they'd help them, you know, find another job, or give them a good recommendation, or something, showing them that you actually care. And I think that's what the whole difference is. If you have to do especially something like that, how you do it is what's important, not necessarily the action itself, because the person will still look back and be like, okay, yes, that happened. It was not the choice, but you know, they did something good for me, and they did try to help me in that way.
Mm.
And I wanted to come on to your book, Softening the Edge, because I think there's so many key points in it that are really interesting. But and since you said in 2018 is when this all really became like a passion for you,
Mm.
what was your motivation for writing the book?
You know, I always say the book wrote me rather than the other way around, because I
Okay.
really feel like that. I can barely remember writing it. You know, I mean, of course I can remember, right? I can remember sitting at my desk and sitting in coffee shops. And I always talk about, I write a lot in hotel lobbies. I love hotel lobbies. Of course I can remember writing it, but I think it was such an experience of passion. It felt like such a need for me to write about this. And I had been obviously researching quite a lot before and during, that the words just came. I just felt that it was a conversation that really needed to be had. And I'm not sure if I told this story on the podcast you heard, but I often tell the story of when I told my mum that my book was going to be published, and she said, well, that's, you know, that's fantastic news and whatever. But darling, who wants to read a book about empathy? And, you know, she was right in that, because no one was talking about it, I had this sixth sense, this intuition, this desire to change that. And I said to her, and I said to everyone I met at the time, but we need to. And of course, I had no idea that COVID was on its way, but I did have this belief that in 2020 something would change. I just knew it. I just knew that this year, that things they can't carry on, and that someone has to lead this conversation. And there are other people as well, of course, you know, Ali being one of them, talking about empathy and understanding and humanity. So I'm by no means, you know, on my own on that journey. But I think that's what led me to do it. I think it was part this desire to do something. You know, I think we talk a lot about how the world should be and what change we would like to see. But if we don't partake in that, then you're kind of a spectator in your own world. And I didn't want to be a spectator.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I love the way you said that the book wrote you, not the other way around. And given all your experiences that came together, it sounds like yes, there was research, but I think there was a lot of experiences that you probably went through that have come into the book, which show why you've experienced why empathy is so important, and why you felt that in 2020, COVID or without, that this is the time that something has to give. We didn't expect it to give this much, but you know, it is what it is. And I wanted to also talk about, let everyone know, talk to us about the Secrets of the Gap, your podcast. I actually heard one of the episodes with Carl Bronze.
Mm.
Yeah,
Yeah, he's
which
fabulous.
yeah, he's amazing, and I thought it was a really, really interesting episode. But to people who don't know, tell us what that's all about.
Yeah. So Secrets of the Gap is, as you said, it's my podcast. It's a conversation piece. Actually, I'm in the process of changing the format a little bit for January. But fundamentally, it's the audio version of this journey for me. I'm having conversations with people all around the world, leaders, teachers, thinkers, just people, about empathy and about how that's impacted their journeys, what it is, what has it meant to them. When you don't have empathy, what's the downside, what happens, and just having those conversations. And as I said, I've got some big changes ahead, which is really exciting, for 2021. But I think it's been a great platform for me, particularly in COVID, to meet people and have these conversations and talk to people I never would have otherwise met about the role of empathy and what it is, and people have, you know, varying understandings and sort of responses to it, from people that have talked there about sort of B Corps and conscious capitalism, and, you know, what is business with a conscience and purpose, to youth, and, you know, what's going on with youth, why do they need more empathy, is there an empathy deficit, you know, neutrally across society. Cal Bruns and I talk a lot about creativity, marketing, making change. So yeah, it's been a really fun project. I mean, like you, I think just the act of having conversations with who were once strangers and by the end are not, is a phenomenal act of humanity in itself, I think.
Yeah, I resonate with that so much. Like you said, being able to have these kind of conversations about a topic that you're so passionate about, and getting people's different perspectives, and even meeting new people. Like, for example, today, this is the first time me and you meet, and I've had this kind of experience so
Yeah.
many times already in this past year, and it's just been amazing. I'm curious, from all the people that you've spoken to so far, what is one thing that you've learned now about empathy, given the conversations you've had, that you didn't know before you did the podcast? I'm curious.
Mm. I'm gonna answer with your question, actually, because you just used the word curious. And what I didn't think about until, you know, these conversations, and I was sort of mounting energy in this area, was how important curiosity is as a facet. And in fact, that's what I'm going to write my second book about, is around curiosity as the path to empathy. It's not that I didn't know it, it's just I didn't ever coin it. I didn't ever really focus on it. And of course, I've been in the creative industries my entire career. Curiosity is what fuels our business, right? It's what fuels our entire industry. But the sort of, as I said, the coining in my head of that insight, that curiosity drives understanding, that inquiry leads to empathy, was something that came to me through those conversations and through just hearing other people's perspectives on things. And I think there's a big lesson, there's a big theme in there for us all. Because, you know, often if you go back to like the 40s and 50s, parents would tell their children, don't ask questions, it's rude. You know, don't inquire into other people's lives. Don't be curious. It's rude. It's not polite. It's certainly from a British point of view back in those days. But I think as the world gets smaller, we have to be curious, right? We're all together in this. And so, yeah, I definitely would say curiosity is something that has really become a passion point for me, and something that I hadn't really focused on when I wrote the first book.
That's really interesting, that curiosity. It makes a lot, hearing your explanation, it makes a lot of sense about, you know, the desire to be curious, the willingness to inquire and try to understand someone else's perspective. So is curiosity, do you believe that that's the first step in learning how to become an empathetic person, the ability to be curious? Like if you look at because it's interesting that you said your second book's going to be about curiosity. So would you look at that as the sequel to the first, or a prequel?
Oh, good question. No, I think it's the sequel. I think
Okay.
the first step is conviction. So if we're going to do a little, you know, a PowerPoint slide that would fit in a nice boardroom, we'll have 2 C's. We'll have conviction and then curiosity, because I think you do have to have that awareness and that conviction first. As we've said, in order for your brain to activate empathy, you have to want it to. You have to be interested in that. You have to be convinced that empathy is of skill that you want to use, you know, in order to give those instructions to your brain. But then in order to improve and enhance that empathy, in order to make that something that's habitual and is valuable and is adding value to you, then I think that's where, you know, the curiosity comes in. So maybe I'm making an equation up on your show, but I think it would be,
There we go.
I think it would be conviction, and then it would be around being convinced. So the real belief in it, then the real evidence around it, and then the sort of practice of that, which would be, you know, this sort of frequent.
I think, like you said, conviction and curiosity, I think that would be what you need to start moving into that direction. Like if we were going to, like you said, come up with an equation for it, those are the two crucial things before you even get into, you know, the listening and everything. You have to first believe in it yourself, and then be genuinely curious to want to learn it with other people. Do you think, as you explained that, I was trying to think of this, do you think empathy is just about empathizing with other people, or do you think empathy also applies to ourselves? Because we all have that voice inside of our head, the voice that, you know, that negative voice, or that voice that gives us doubts and so on. So can it be done on a personal level, or is it just empathy specifically with other people?
No, for sure. I talk quite a bit about self-empathy, which is absolutely what you described, which is the ability to understand ourselves and be connected with ourselves. And I think it's quite nicely explained when you think of when you're on an aeroplane, you know, back in the day prior to COVID, on the ground. But when we used to be on airplanes and they would do the safety checks, and they say that thing around, you know, if the oxygen masks fall down, put your own oxygen mask on first before helping others. I like to sort of use that as an analogy for self-empathy, which is that if you are going to empathize with others, then you need to at least understand yourself, right? In order to be a great leader or a great sister, friend, brother, whatever, someone that connects and understands others, you have to be connected to yourself. You have to know, you know, what makes you tick, what helps you, what makes you healthy, what inspires you and leads you to thrive. So absolutely, self-empathy is a big discussion point, I think, and certainly taps into what you were saying earlier about being passionate yourself about, you know, wellness and health, and and how we lead those conversations about, yeah, being well, being good, being healthy, being kind. That all starts with you, for sure.
Yeah. And I think that analogy explains it and says it perfectly. Because when you take care of yourself first, and like, I guess, be empathetic with yourself first, understand yourself, connect with yourself. And that's how you have to first take care of what's, on the inside and yourself before you can start, projecting it to other people and to the outside world. I think that analogy explains it beautifully. Mimi, I want to be conscious of our time, so I just have 2 more questions for you. And
Okay.
these are questions I ask everyone on the podcast. So, looking back over your career of 14 years in the advertising space, and now as being an advocate for empathy and so on, what would you say is either your proudest moment, or what are you most proud of?
Oh, I think I'm most proud of 2020. I'm
Okay,
gonna give you a whole year as the answer,
awesome.
because I think whilst terrible things happened this year, and we can't take away from how horrendous the world has been, how horrendous it has been for the world to try and fight and recover from what COVID-19 has done. For me personally, it has also, I talk about the worst best moment. Because it has been a worst moment, but it has been the best of those worst moments, in that I did finish my book. I finished my book in lockdown, all alone in the Middle East as a single mum. I launched a podcast. I launched a breakfast show that's had just around 90,000 views, and I was in my bedroom for most of it. This year for me has been an incredibly proud year, and it's only really recently, like last week at GITEX, probably, that I have, talk about self-empathy, that I have really understood and come to terms with that. So I think if we'd spoken, I think we were first scheduled to speak about probably 3 weeks ago now, I wouldn't have given this answer. Everything happens for a reason. So because I want to tell you this really quick story. I know we're running out of time, but last week, for all the listeners tuning in, we're sitting today talking in the UAE, in Dubai, and last week in Dubai we had GITEX, big technology conference, and as part of that conference we had a delegation from Israel, which is a big change within the Middle East, because Israel and the UAE haven't been politically friendly for a very long time. What that meant was there was a whole week of content and celebrations, peace celebrations. And I was very lucky to be invited to an event one evening where the chairman of the foreign exchange from Israel stood up. We were in the Dubai Opera House, and spoke about, he didn't use the word empathy, but he spoke about mutual understanding. He spoke about the need to be understood as two nations and to work together. And I had just this most amazing moment when I sat there in the Opera House with sheikhs and phenomenally important people, thinking, I did this. As in, I got myself to this seat tonight, sitting in the Opera House, watching Andrea Bocelli, who had been flown in on a private jet live. It was a really poignant moment for me, that I could have not done that. I could have had a very different year. And I think that's why I'm proud. I'm proud that I've managed to change my life in a way. And it, like I always say, it wasn't easy. In fact, it never is. No day is easy, right? It's not like a dream that miraculously appears. It's been really tough. And as I said, I'm a single mum. I'm here all alone. It's tough. But it's, the year has ended in a place where I feel like I have really renewed energy to go into 2021. So that was a long answer to your question, but it's a nice story.
Yeah, it's typically the longer answers are the better ones. So thank you for sharing that story. And it's really amazing, and congratulations for you to have that moment. It's that like click when you, just like
Yeah.
we are saying, when you're sitting down and you're like, oh wow, yeah, I got myself here. I put in the work. It was, like I said, it's never easy. And especially given this, what a hectic year this has been,
Yeah.
for you to come out to feel this way at the end of it and to look back and of everything you accomplished is an amazing feeling, because I feel the same way. Like I said, it's been my best worst year. I think that's a very good way to talk about it. So I definitely resonate with that, and congratulations. And
Thank you.
for my last question, Mimi, this is what I ask all my guests, is what is the message you'd like everyone to take home with them today?
I would like people to take home that we are more alike than we are different. I think it's the most important message out there today, which is that regardless of language, context, culture, history, any of those things, as human beings, we are better together. We do better together, and we are more alike than we are different. At the end of the day, we are just human beings on this planet sharing a future, and we can control that. So yeah, that would be my message. We're more alike than we are different, and we're better together, and we should all connect far more if we want to see a better tomorrow.
I think that's a beautiful way to end the podcast, and an amazing message that we are a lot more similar than, you know, we tend to think sometimes. And like you said, we are better together. We got here being together. So if we want to get to where we're trying to go next, that's the way forward. So I totally agree. Mimi, thank you so much for your time today. It's been an absolute pleasure. I've loved this conversation and getting your perspective on empathy, and congratulations on what you've accomplished this year. And just thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
You are so welcome. Thank you for having me. It's been, as you said, it's been an absolute pleasure, and well done you too. Fantastic year as well. So both of us can go home happy this evening. Thank you so much for having me.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much, guys. To everyone listening, thanks as always. And as always, hope it helps. Peace.